The golden ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria gleamed under the light of hundreds of candles dancing in majestic crystal chandeliers, casting moving shadows over the marble walls. The aroma of champagne mingled with the imported perfumes of New York high society, creating an atmosphere of opulence that Griffin Blackwood breathed in with familiar indifference. At 37, this New Englander with penetrating eyes and impeccable bearing had conquered the business world with the same determination with which he now kept his own emotions in check. A heart that closes out of fear will never feel true freedom, he had once written in a journal he no longer read, tucked away in the deepest drawer of his mahogany desk in his penthouse on Park Avenue. As he held a barely tasted glass of Cabernet, he observed the social spectacle, like someone watching a mediocre play. The businessmen competed to demonstrate generosity toward charitable causes many would forget by tomorrow, and artificial laughter rose like bubbles in champagne, effervescent but empty. An extraordinary evening, wouldn't you agree, Griffin? The velvet voice of Vivian Montgomery, his Boston-bred partner, pulled him from his thoughts. Like all the others, he replied with a practiced smile that never reached his steel-blue eyes. That's when he saw her. Amid the sea of ostentatious dresses and dazzling jewelry, a young woman contemplated with genuine admiration a painting by Edward Hopper. She was dressed with an elegant simplicity that contrasted with the surrounding opulence, a navy blue dress that seemed to aspire to nothing more than clothing her. It wasn't her beauty that caught his attention, though she was undeniably charming with her dark hair, gathered in an unpretentious bun, and her porcelain skin. It was the authenticity of her expression, the way her brown eyes absorbed each brushstroke with true fascination. Griffin found himself walking toward her before his brain could process the decision. For the first time in 7 years, since that chapel in Newport where he had waited hours for a bride who never arrived, something inside him moved without his permission. The interplay of light and shadow is remarkable, isn't it? He commented, stopping at a respectable distance. She turned, surprised, and their eyes met. It's as if he captured the light and shadow not just of the body, but of the soul, she responded, with an accent that revealed her southern origins. Griffin Blackwood, he introduced himself, extending his hand. Laurel Harrington, she replied, shaking it firmly. Art restorer from the small diocesan museum in Savannah. Something in her touch sent an imperceptible current through Griffin's arm, awakening sensations he had sworn were permanently dormant. Fate, that unpredictable playwright, had just raised the curtain on a play that would forever change the carefully controlled script of his life. What Griffin didn't know, as they exchanged impressions about Hopper and O'Keeffe, was that he was breaking down the first stone of a wall he had built over 7 years, and that this young woman with transparent eyes held secrets that could either destroy or redeem everything he thought he knew about love, betrayal, and forgiveness. The 3 weeks following the gala transformed into a strange dance of seemingly casual encounters. For a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his life, Griffin surprised himself by modifying his schedule to coincidentally pass by the Metropolitan Museum of Art on days when he knew Laurel was attending a restoration course. I find this coincidence curious, Mr. Blackwood, she said one April afternoon as the New York sun began to warm the stone-paved streets. It's the 3rd time this week we've run into each other. The imperceptible blush that colored the businessman's cheeks was a phenomenon that even his closest colleagues wouldn't have believed possible. Art relaxes me, he responded, with practiced nonchalance. It's the only place where I don't think about contracts or figures. Curious, she smiled, with a spark of challenge in her eyes, because yesterday you were staring fixedly at nighthawks while talking on the phone about profit percentages. A spontaneous laugh escaped Griffin's lips, surprising even himself. He couldn't remember the last time he had laughed without calculating it beforehand. That afternoon they shared coffee at a cafe near Washington Square Park. Under the murmur of conversations from writers and artists, she told him about Blakely, the small historic town in Georgia where she had grown up, about the sloping streets lined with oak trees draped in Spanish moss, about the 4th of July celebrations where everyone knew each other, and about her grandmother Eleanor, who made the best peach cobbler in the world. "You speak as if it were another planet," he commented, fascinated by how her eyes sparkled when remembering her homeland. "It is compared to your world of skyscrapers and board meetings. In Blakely, wealth is measured by how many neighbors come to help when you need it, not by how many zeros are in your bank account." The words struck Griffin harder than she could imagine. As he watched her speak, he realized he couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at him, without first seeing his fortune or his influence. That night, in the solitude of his minimalist penthouse, with panoramic views of a New York that never slept, Griffin found himself contemplating his reflection in the windows. At what point did I stop being a person and become an empire? He wondered, feeling the weight of an invisible armor he no longer remembered putting on. In his office the next day, Fletcher Redmond, his best friend since their university days at Yale, and now his main attorney, noticed something different about him. "You look different," he commented as they reviewed contracts. "Almost human." "Don't talk nonsense," Griffin responded dryly, but a muscle in his jaw tensed, betraying him. "Be careful, my friend," Fletcher added with unusual seriousness. "Deep wounds heal falsely. One blow in the right place is all it takes for them to bleed again." Griffin ignored the comment, but the words stayed with him, like a silent warning that resonated as he, that same afternoon, invited Laurel to dinner. The first of many dinners that would follow, each one imperceptibly bringing down another stone from the wall he had built around his heart. What Griffin couldn't foresee was that, somewhere in London, Dr. Malcolm Harrington, Laurel's father, was receiving an email with the subject line, "I found him." The contents of that message would set in motion a chain of events that would test the very foundations of this story, just beginning. The first time Laurel entered Griffin's penthouse was an accident precipitated by New York rain, as unpredictable as the feelings beginning to stir beneath the businessman's controlled surface. They had been walking through the Upper East Side after dinner, where she had tried Maine lobster for the first time, and confessed, laughing, that she preferred her grandmother Eleanor's fried chicken. The first drops fell while they animatedly discussed whether Hemingway was better than Faulkner, and soon the sky opened in one of those autumn storms that transform streets into improvised rivers. They ran seeking shelter, and Griffin's apartment was the closest option. "Your home looks like it came straight out of an architectural magazine," she commented, while drying her hair with a towel that smelled of lavender. "It's perfect, immaculate, and sadly, impersonal." The observation, devoid of malice but laden with truth, pierced Griffin like an arrow. "Functionality doesn't need sentimentality," he responded automatically, reciting a phrase that had become his life philosophy. Laurel slowly toured the space, stopping before the only visible photograph, Griffin shaking hands with the president during an official reception. "Where are the photos with friends, with family, memories from travels? Not everything needs to be displayed," he murmured, suddenly uncomfortable. Looking for a phone charger, she opened the wrong drawer and discovered what Griffin had hidden so carefully, a collection of photographs from another time, of another man. Images of a smiling Griffin at Mardi Gras in New Orleans, embracing friends, living with an intensity that painfully contrasted with his meticulously controlled present. "This is you," she whispered, holding a photograph as if it were a fragile treasure. "The real you." "That's the past," he cut her off, trying to recover the images, but she didn't return them. Instead, she approached with a look that mixed curiosity and something deeper, something he didn't want to recognize. "What happened to that man?" she asked with a disarming softness. "Who hurt you so badly that you decided to bury him?" The words made their way through his defenses before he could contain them. "Her name was Audrey," he began, and once the first drop escaped, the entire dam gave way. "We were about to get married. The ceremony in Newport, 300 guests, everything perfect, except she never arrived. I waited 5 hours in that chapel, while the guests whispered and my mother cried discreetly. Finally, her maid of honor handed me a letter, 3 paragraphs to explain that she couldn't tie herself to a life she didn't really want." Laurel listened in silence, her eyes never leaving his, supporting him without words. "That day I made a promise," continued Griffin, his voice now barely a whisper. "I would never again allow someone to have the power to destroy me like that. Love is a weakness I can't afford." "Love is not a weakness," she replied, coming so close he could feel her breath. "It's the greatest strength we have. What's truly brave is not avoiding pain, but risking feeling despite it." And then, with the rain beating against the windows and nocturnal New York drawing shadows on the walls, Laurel did the unexpected. She stood on her tiptoes and brushed her lips against Griffin's, a kiss so delicate it could have been imagined, but so real that it shook the foundations of his carefully constructed existence. That night, as the storm abated outside, another far more powerful one unleashed inside Griffin Blackwood. For the first time in 7 years, he felt fear. Not of rejection or abandonment, but of what was awakening in him, the dangerous hope that perhaps, just perhaps, promises were made to be broken. What he didn't know was that Laurel, while sleeping in the guest room of that immaculate apartment, also harbored secrets. Secrets that, when brought to light, would test not only their nascent relationship, but Griffin's very capacity to forgive and move forward. The following 2 months passed in a dance of approaches and retreats. To any outside observer, the relationship between Griffin Blackwood and Laurel Harrington made no sense. He, a business shark whose name regularly appeared on the covers of economic magazines. She, a young art restorer whose greatest achievement had been recovering an 18th century altarpiece in a small Georgia church. "You're exposing yourself too much," Vivian warned him during a board meeting, her words laden with professional concern, but her green eyes betraying other feelings. "The press is beginning to speculate about your personal life. That's never happened before." "My personal life is precisely that." "Personal," Griffin replied coldly, closing a folder with more force than necessary. But Vivian was right. Control, that obsession that had defined his existence for years, was beginning to slip through his fingers. He could no longer predict his own reactions when Laurel sent him a message, or when he caught her looking at him with that mixture of tenderness and challenge that disarmed him. One afternoon, while reviewing documents in his office, he received a call that would change the course of events. "Mr. Blackwood," the voice of his private investigator sounded tense, "I've discovered something about Miss Harrington that you should know." Griffin felt a sudden chill. For years he had investigated everyone who approached his inner circle, a precaution that had become routine. With Laurel, he had hesitated, but finally caution prevailed. Now something in the investigator's tone told him that perhaps it would have been better not to know. "The small museum where she works is on the verge of bankruptcy," the man continued, "and her family faces serious economic problems. Her grandmother, Eleanor Harrington, has been receiving oncological treatment at Emory University Hospital. The bills are considerable." The information hit Griffin like a slap, not for what it implied, but for what it revealed about Laurel. She had never mentioned these difficulties, had never even hinted that she needed help, despite knowing perfectly well who he was and what he could do with a simple bank transfer. "There's something else," the investigator added, hesitating. "About her father." Griffin's heart accelerated. Laurel barely spoke of her father, only mentioning that he was a doctor and had lived in England for years. "Dr. Malcolm Harrington lost his medical license 7 years ago due to a serious error in treating a patient. I can't confirm the details, but he left the United States shortly after. 7 years. The temporal coincidence with his own personal tragedy didn't escape Griffin. That night, as they dined at a small restaurant in Greenwich Village, away from indiscreet eyes, he observed Laurel with new eyes. She spoke animatedly about a restoration project, her hands moving with enthusiasm, her face lit by a passion he had forgotten how to feel. "Why have you never spoken about your grandmother?" he asked suddenly, interrupting her. Laurel's smile froze, a shadow crossing her gaze. "What do you mean?" "About her illness, the medical bills, your family's financial difficulties." The silence that followed was so dense it could have been cut. Finally, she set down her cutlery with meticulous precision. "You investigated me." It wasn't a question, but a painful observation. "It's what I do with everyone," he defended himself, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I'm not everyone, Griffin." The disappointment in her voice was palpable. "I believed we were building something based on trust. Trust is built on honesty. You weren't completely honest either." "Honest?" Her eyes flashed with indignation. "Do you think I should have told you about my financial problems on our first dates? Hello, I'm Laurel. I love Baroque art, and by the way, my grandmother is dying and we can't pay for the treatment. Is that what you expected?" Griffin ran a hand over his face, suddenly tired. "I want to help you," he said simply. "I don't need your help," she responded with a dignity that struck him. "I'm not a charity project, Griffin. If you're with me because I make you feel like a hero saving the poor girl from a small town, then this was a mistake from the beginning." She stood up, collecting her purse. "Laurel, wait," he tried to stop her. "You're misinterpreting this." "No, I think I'm finally seeing clearly," her eyes filled with contained tears. "You don't want a relationship, Griffin. You want a controlled exchange where you can measure every risk, where you can buy solutions for every problem. But real love doesn't work that way." And with those words, she left the restaurant, leaving him with an unpaid bill and a painful realization. For the first time in years, he had lost control of something important. And the worst part was that he didn't know how to get it back. What Griffin couldn't imagine was that, while he was dealing with this personal crisis, a much greater one was brewing in the offices of his business empire, one that would test not only his principles, but also his newly discovered capacity to feel. The glass and steel building that housed the headquarters of the Blackwood Group seemed to shine with its own light under the autumn sun of New York. In the boardroom on the top floor, however, the atmosphere was glacial despite the 70 degrees marked by the thermometers on Fifth Avenue. "It's unacceptable," Griffin's voice cut through the air-conditioned air like a knife. "Completely unacceptable." On the polished oak table, the reports detailed the working conditions in the textile factories in North Carolina, operated by his southern partner. 14-hour workdays, absence of safety measures, disguised child labor. All this to produce the exclusive clothing lines that generated millions for the conglomerate. "Griffin, be reasonable," Vivian intervened, her impeccable Armani suit contrasting with the tension on her face. "These practices are unfortunate, but common in the region. Terminating the contract with Harrison would cost the company around $40 million. The shareholders would crucify us. Not to mention the legal implications," Fletcher added, leafing through documents with a worried expression. "The contract is ironclad. The penalty for unilateral termination would be astronomical." Griffin rose and walked to the window. From there he could see the city he had conquered, the empire he had built with relentless determination, an empire that now, he discovered, was partially cemented on the suffering of innocence. His phone vibrated. A message from Laurel. "3 days without speaking is punishment enough for both of us. Coffee in Central Park at 6? Something contracted in his chest. They had argued, yes, but she hadn't given up on him. Despite her wounded pride, despite the invasion of her privacy, despite everything, she was offering a bridge, a way back. "Griffin," Vivian's voice brought him back to the room. "We need a decision." He turned, contemplating the expectant faces of his executive team. Brilliant men and women, dedicated to maximizing profits, optimizing resources, growing without limits, as he had taught them. "What is the price of your soul?" Laurel's question, pronounced days before during a conversation about business ethics, resonated in his mind with crystal clarity. "We terminate the contract," he announced, his voice quiet but firm. Immediately. Chaos erupted in the room. Voices rising in protest, economic arguments, veiled threats about shareholder reactions. Griffin let them talk, his resolution unshakable. "We'll present a contingency plan," he continued when the noise subsided. "We'll relocate production to American workshops paying fair wages. Yes, the margins will be smaller, but we'll sleep soundly." "This makes no business sense," Vivian protested, incredulity painted on her perfect face. "This isn't the Griffin I know." "Perhaps you never really knew me," he responded, surprising everyone, including himself. "Or perhaps I'm rediscovering who I want to be." Later, sitting across from Laurel at a table overlooking the lake in Central Park, where New Yorkers sought refuge from the relentless heat, Griffin found himself relating the day's events. Not as an achievement, not expecting admiration, but sharing a difficult decision with someone whose opinion surprisingly mattered to him. $40 million, she whistled, impressed. "That's a fortune." "It's money," he corrected. "Just money. Coming from the man who has a Rothko in his bathroom, that's quite a statement of principles," she joked, but her eyes reflected something deeper. Respect. "I've spent years measuring my worth in figures and contracts," Griffin confessed. "Perhaps it's time to find a new unit of measurement." Laurel extended her hand across the table, intertwining her fingers with his, a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. "My grandmother always says we're rich by what we give, not by what we have. I'd like to meet her." The words came out before he could think them through. Laurel's smile widened, illuminating her whole face. "She wants to meet you too." "Actually, She hesitated for a moment. "I was thinking of going to Blakely this weekend. The Harvest Festival is starting and it's a beautiful time. You could come with me." The invitation floated between them, laden with implications. It wasn't just meeting her grandmother. It was entering her world, her real life, far from the charity galas and dinners in starred restaurants. "I'd love to," he replied, surprised by how much he meant it. What neither could imagine was that, while they planned this trip that would mark a before and after in their relationship, revelations were brewing in the shadows that would test the very limits of Griffin's newly discovered capacity to forgive and move forward. Blakely appeared before them like a vision from another time. White clapboard houses lined up on a hill, winding streets shaded by ancient oaks draped with Spanish moss, and a sky of an almost painful blue that contrasted with the colonial rooftops. The small Georgia town seemed taken from a historical tale, suspended in a time where skyscrapers and board meetings had no place. Laurel's old Volvo labored up the county road. Griffin, accustomed to his chauffeured Bentley, discovered the strange freedom of driving with the windows down, the wind disheveling his hair, while she sang off-key to Allman Brothers songs. "You look different," commented Laurel, glancing at him sidelong. "With that wrinkled shirt and tousled hair, you could almost pass for a normal person." He laughed, a sound that each day became more natural. "And is that good or bad?" "It's wonderful," she replied, and the sincerity in her voice moved him more than he was prepared to admit. Eleanor Harrington's Victorian house stood in the upper part of town, with a privileged view of the valley. In the small garden, aromatic plants grew in controlled disorder, and the scent of rosemary and thyme floated in the warm afternoon air. "My sweet girl." The warm voice preceded the appearance of a small woman with an imposing presence. "You're finally here. I was beginning to think you'd gotten lost." Eleanor Harrington was the antithesis of what Griffin expected. Despite the illness mentioned in the report, she radiated a contagious vitality. Her 78 years manifested in the wrinkles that furrowed her sun-weathered face, but her eyes, the same deep brown as her granddaughter's, sparkled with sharp intelligence and a spark of mischief. "So you're the famous Griffin," she said, evaluating him from head to toe without pretense. "You have the eyes of someone who has fled from himself." The observation, delivered with the naturalness of someone commenting on the weather, left Griffin momentarily speechless. "Grandma, for heaven's sake," Laurel intervened, blushing. "We just arrived. At least let him enter the house before you psychoanalyze him." The elderly woman laughed, a musical sound that belied her fragile appearance. "Life is too short for beating around the bush, child. You should know that by now." Inside, the house was like a journey through time. Old but well-maintained furniture, family photographs in mismatched frames, and the irresistible aroma of something cooking over a low flame. "I've prepared Brunswick stew," announced Eleanor, leading them to a kitchen where hand-painted tiles told stories of generations. "And peach cobbler as you like it, Laurel. I suppose the businessman is accustomed to more refined foods, but—" "The businessman," interrupted Griffin with a smile, "can't remember the last time he ate something prepared with so much care. It smells delicious." Dinner passed amid town anecdotes, laughter, and a local wine that, though it would never win international awards, had a character that the wines from his private cellar could never equal. Griffin surprised himself by relating stories of his childhood in the small coastal town of Kennebunkport, memories he had buried under years of ambition and business conquests. After dinner, while Laurel washed the dishes, insisting it was family tradition, Eleanor invited him to sit on the small back porch, under a star-filled sky never seen in New York. "My granddaughter is falling in love with you," she said without preamble, serving him a glass of homemade blackberry brandy. "And I think you are with her too, though it frightens you so much you can hardly breathe when you look at her." Griffin almost choked on the liquor. "Ma'am, Eleanor. Or Grandma, if you prefer. I've never been a ma'am of anything." There was a silence, not uncomfortable but expectant, as if the universe were holding its breath. "You're right," he finally admitted, the words freeing themselves like birds from a long-closed cage. "I'm frightened by what I feel for her. I'm frightened of not being enough or being too much. I'm frightened that one day she'll wake up and realize she deserves something better than a man who has forgotten how to love, without calculating risks." "Love is always a risk, son." The elderly woman took a sip from her glass. It's the only thing worth risking in this life. 7 years ago I made a promise, continued Griffin, the Georgia stars as witnesses to a confession he never thought he'd make. I swore I would never again allow someone to have the power to destroy me. Promises made from pain are chains, not shields, she responded, with a wisdom that only years can give. They protect you from suffering, yes, but also from living. From the kitchen came the soft humming of Laurel, an old melody that seemed to intertwine with the conversation. Her father, began Griffin, hesitating. What really happened with him? Eleanor's eyes clouded briefly. Malcolm was a good doctor but a tormented man. He believed so strongly in his duty to protect that sometimes he crossed lines. One day, a patient of his was about to make a terrible mistake. He intervened, convinced he was saving her from herself. The consequences, well, they were complicated. A chill ran down Griffin's spine. A suspicion that had been forming in his mind for days began to take shape. This patient, his voice sounded strange, even to his own ears. Was she about to get married? The look Eleanor gave him was laden with a knowledge that transcended what was said. Laurel doesn't know, she responded simply. Or at least, she thinks I don't know. The coincidences of fate are sometimes too perfect to be coincidences, don't you think? Before he could respond, Laurel appeared at the door, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. What are you two talking about so mysteriously? The stars, her grandmother replied, winking at Griffin. About how sometimes they align to create constellations that seemed impossible. That night in the small guest room, where the mattress was too soft and the sheets smelled of wild lavender, Griffin contemplated the ceiling of ancient beams, his mind a whirlwind of revelations. Laurel's father, Dr. Malcolm Harrington, had been the one who advised Audrey to abandon him 7 years ago. The coincidence was so cruel, so perfect in its symmetry, that it seemed like a cosmic joke. And now, by a twisted twist of fate, he had fallen in love with the daughter of the man who had destroyed his previous life. The question that kept him awake until dawn was not whether he could forgive that involuntary connection, but whether he would have the courage to tell Laurel about it, risking everything they had begun to build together. What he couldn't imagine was that she in her room across the hall contemplated the same ceiling with equally sleepless eyes, harboring secrets of her own that would soon come to light. The return to New York after the weekend in Blakely brought with it a silence laden with unspoken words. The old Volvo advanced along the highway while storm clouds accumulated on the horizon, a perfect reflection of the emotional climate inside the vehicle. "You're very quiet," Laurel finally observed, her eyes fixed on the road. "Do you regret coming?" Griffin contemplated the changing landscape, the fields of upstate New York stretching arid under a threatening sky. "On the contrary," he replied with sincerity, "I think I needed to see that world, your world. But something's bothering you." It wasn't a question. Eleanor's revelations weighed on his conscience like lead. Dr. Malcolm Harrington, Laurel's father, had been indirectly responsible for the greatest wound of his life. Should he tell her? Did he have the right to burden her with that knowledge? Before he could decide, Griffin's phone rang with the insistence of bad news. Fletcher's tense voice confirmed his fears. "The press has the story," he announced without preamble. "Tomorrow it's on the front page. Blackwood Empire totters after termination of $1 million contract. There are leaks about the conditions in the North Carolina factories and, Griffin, they're linking it all with your relationship with an unknown small-town art restorer. They're insinuating you've lost your edge, that you're making business decisions based on emotions." Griffin's stomach contracted. Not because of the impending business crisis, but because of how it would affect Laurel. "Who leaked the information?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Vivian," confirmed Fletcher. "She's called an extraordinary shareholders meeting for tomorrow. They're going to attempt a vote of no confidence, Griffin. They want to remove you from the chairmanship." The call ended just as the first raindrops hit the windshield. Laurel looked at him sidelong, concern evident on her face. "Problems," she guessed. "Nothing I can't handle," he lied, trying to protect her. "Don't underestimate me, Griffin." Her voice took on a cutting edge. "I'm not a child you need to shield from the truth." The rain was now increasing, turning the road into a dangerous mirror. Laurel reduced speed, looking for a safe place to stop. "You're going to be in all the newspapers tomorrow," Griffin finally admitted. "Our relationship. They're going to use it to attack me, to suggest I've lost the capacity to make rational decisions. A gas station appeared on the horizon, a temporary refuge from the deluge. Laurel parked under the canopy and turned off the engine, the silence broken only by the furious patter of the rain. "And is that what you think?" she asked, turning to face him. "That you've allowed me to influence your decisions?" The question floated between them, laden with implications. "I think you've helped me remember who I was before I became what the world expected of me," he responded honestly. "Before I built walls so high they isolated me even from myself." Something in Laurel's eyes changed, a sudden vulnerability she rarely showed. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Griffin's heart accelerated. Did she already know about her father? About Audrey? "I'm listening," he said, preparing for the worst. "When I met you at that gala at the Waldorf," and she began, her fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. It wasn't a coincidence. The confession was suspended when a lightning bolt illuminated the sky, followed instantly by a deafening thunder. The gas station lights flickered and went out, leaving them in a misty penumbra. "What do you mean?" Griffin asked, his voice calm, contrasting with his internal chaos. "My father contacted me from London weeks before," she continued, the words now coming out like an unstoppable torrent. "He told me about a patient of his from years ago, a woman named Audrey Mitchell, who deeply regretted having abandoned her fiancé at the altar. My father had counseled her then, convinced he was saving her from an unhappy marriage. With time, he understood he had made a terrible mistake, that he had interfered in others' lives based on his own fears." Griffin listened, paralyzed, as the puzzle pieces fit together with painful precision. "He asked me to find you," Laurel's voice broke slightly, "to discover what kind of man you really were, if the abandonment had irreparably hardened you, or if perhaps there was still hope for redemption for everyone involved." The silence that followed was dense, almost tangible. The rain was now falling with less intensity, but the storm inside the car had barely begun. "It was all a lie?" Griffin finally asked, each word a heavy stone. "A reconnaissance mission to ease your father's guilt?" "No," she exclaimed, tears forming in her eyes. "At the beginning, perhaps, I just wanted to meet you, to understand. But afterward, everything that happened between us was real, Griffin. More real than anything in my life. When were you planning to tell me?" His voice sounded strangely distant, as if it belonged to someone else. "Or were you hoping I would never find out?" "I wanted to tell you 1,000 times," she confessed. Each day that passed made it more difficult. "I feared losing you. I feared you wouldn't be able to see beyond this terrible connection." The gas station lights came back on, illuminating Laurel's face streaked with silent tears. Outside, the storm was beginning to abate, but Griffin felt that the real tempest was just beginning. "I need time," he finally said, opening the car door. "I need to think." "Griffin, please," she pleaded, "don't go like this." But he was already outside, the rain immediately soaking him. Phone in hand, he called his driver as he walked away from the Volvo, and the woman who, in a few months, had brought down walls he thought impenetrable. What he didn't know, as he waited under the gas station canopy, was that this revelation wasn't the end of their story, but merely the beginning of a path to redemption that would test everything he thought he knew about forgiveness and the human capacity to rewrite one's own destiny. The days following Laurel's revelation were a media whirlwind. Just as Fletcher had predicted, the headlines were merciless. "The Midas King loses his touch. From shark to lamb. Blackwood's transformation. The art restorer who changed an empire." Photographs of them together, some taken with telephoto lenses in moments they believed private, adorned the covers of magazines and newspapers. The extraordinary shareholders' meeting resulted in a technical tie, insufficient to remove him as chairman, but a clear warning that his position was no longer untouchable. Vivienne, with her perfect grey suit and calculated smile, had orchestrated the rebellion with surgical precision. "It's not personal, Griffin," she told him afterward, in the deserted hallway. "It's business. You always taught me to separate the two." "I taught you many things, Vivienne," he responded, an icy calm in his voice, "but it seems loyalty wasn't one of them." The penthouse that had once seemed a refuge of order and control had become a glass and steel prison. The panoramic views of New York, which he had valued so much, now only reminded him how far he was from everything that truly mattered. Laurel had tried to contact him. Messages, calls, even a handwritten letter delivered to his office that remained unopened on the coffee table. Part of him yearned to respond, to hear her voice, to let himself be enveloped again by that warmth that had begun to melt the ice within him. But another part, forged in the fire of abandonment 7 years ago, clung to the betrayal as justification for rebuilding the walls. One night, as he contemplated the illuminated city with a glass of 30-year-old whiskey he couldn't taste, the doorbell rang. Upon opening the door, the last person he expected to see was there, small but imposing. Eleanor Harrington. "Are you going to invite me in, or will I have to stay in this impersonal hallway?" she asked, her eyes assessing him with the same intensity as in Blakely. Too surprised to respond, Griffin stepped aside. The elderly woman entered as if the place belonged to her, observing with disapproval the absence of life in the perfectly designed space. "My granddaughter is devastated," she said without preamble, "and from what I see, so are you, though you're trying to hide it even from yourself." "Eleanor, with all due respect—" "Respect is demonstrated by listening, young man," she interrupted, sitting on the designer sofa as if it were the stool in her kitchen. "And I've come to talk." Something in the determination of that small woman reminded him of Laurel, and the thought brought with it a pang of pain he couldn't ignore. "Did you know?" he finally asked. "About your son and Audrey." "I knew when Malcolm called me a few months ago confessing his plan," she nodded. "A plan born of guilt and hope, that dangerous combination." "And you supported it?" Incredulity tinged his voice. "I neither supported nor condemned it," she responded simply. "Life is too complex for absolute judgments, Griffin. My son made a grave mistake, guided by his own fears. Audrey made a decision she would regret forever. You built a fortress around your heart. And my granddaughter, my Laurel decided to get to know you truly beyond the initial mission. She lied to me." The accusation sounded increasingly weak in his own ears. "She concealed a truth she knew would hurt you," corrected Eleanor. "Haven't you done the same? Didn't you investigate her life without her knowledge? Didn't you discover the connection to your past and decide to remain silent?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Wounded pride is a luxury only empty hearts can afford, Griffin," continued the elderly woman, rising with some difficulty. "And you, despite all your efforts, no longer have an empty heart." She headed for the door, but before leaving turned one last time. "My Laurel will be at the Met tomorrow, in the American wing, at noon. It's her last day before returning definitively to Blakely. She's resigned from her position in Savannah." The news hit Griffin like a physical blow. "She's leaving. Tell me, young man." Eleanor's eyes shone with an ancient wisdom. "What reason would she have to stay?" When the door closed behind her, Griffin remained motionless in the center of his perfect living room, feeling for the first time the true dimension of the void surrounding him. It wasn't the apartment that lacked life. It was he himself who had methodically emptied himself over years, turning control and success into poor substitutes for true human connection. He walked to the coffee table and took Laurel's unopened letter. The paper was simple, not the expensive stationery he would use for formal correspondence. His name, written in her irregular and emotive handwriting, seemed to call him. With fingers he didn't remember could tremble, he opened the envelope and began to read. Laurel's words, honest and direct like herself, neither asked for forgiveness nor offered excuses. They simply related a journey, that of a daughter who wanted to help her father redeem himself, and in the process discovered a love she never believed possible. The final lines resonated with a truth so clear it cut through all his defenses. "I don't ask you to forgive the way we met, Griffin. I ask you to honor what we became. If it was all real for you as it was for me, you'll know where to find me. And if it wasn't, then this letter is my way of saying goodbye to what could have been the greatest gift of my life." That night, for the first time in 7 years, Griffin Blackwood cried. Not for what was lost in the past, but for what he might lose in the future, if he didn't find the courage to do the one thing he had never really tried, to forgive. The morning dawned grey over New York, as if the weather itself understood the gravity of the moment. Griffin had been in his office since 5, reviewing documents he would normally delegate, more to keep his mind occupied than out of actual necessity. "You look terrible," commented Fletcher upon entering, placing a cup of coffee on the desk. "When was the last time you slept?" "Sleep is a dispensable luxury," Griffin responded automatically, rubbing his reddened eyes. Have you decided yet what you'll do? The question encompassed much more than the pending business matters. Griffin contemplated the city through the window. Noon was inexorably approaching. In little more than an hour, Laurel would be at the Met, perhaps for the last time. All my life I've made decisions based on data, analyses, probabilities, he murmured, more to himself than to his friend. I've calculated risks, maximized benefits, minimized losses. I've built an empire following that formula. And you've succeeded, Fletcher reminded him. Have I? Griffin turned to face him. What is success, Fletcher? An empty penthouse, bank accounts I can't take to the grave, a name in Forbes that no one will remember in 100 years. His friend remained silent, allowing him to continue. For 7 years I've lived according to that promise made in a chapel in Newport, believing it protected me, continued Griffin. But it didn't protect me from anything. It only locked me in a prison I built myself. And now? Fletcher asked softly. Griffin looked at the clock. 11:15. Time was running out. Now I have to make a decision that no algorithm can calculate for me, he responded, standing up. I need you to manage something in my absence. As he explained what he needed, a new determination settled on his face. It wasn't the cold resolution of the relentless businessman, but something deeper, more human. The decision of a man who finally understood that the true losses and gains of life couldn't be measured in spreadsheets. At 11:40, his Bentley stopped in front of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The rain fell softly, as if the New York sky wept for all the lost opportunities in this city of contained passions. The museum was relatively quiet for a weekday. Griffin advanced through the galleries with determined steps, ignoring the masterpieces he would have admired at another time. His destination was clear, the American wing, where it had all begun. He paused at the entrance, his heart beating with an intensity he hadn't experienced in years. And there she was, with her back to him, contemplating Hopper's early Sunday morning, with the same absorbed admiration she had shown the first time he saw her. She wore a simple green dress that highlighted the curve of her back, and her hair, normally gathered up, fell free over her shoulders. For a moment, Griffin allowed himself simply to observe her, engraving in his memory every detail of her posture, the way she slightly inclined her head when studying a pictorial detail, the subtle movement of her fingers as if they wished to touch the forbidden canvas. Finally, he stepped forward. The interplay of light and shadow is remarkable, isn't it? He said, repeating the first words he had directed to her months ago. Laurel turned slowly, and the impact of her gaze was like a ray piercing the fog that had enveloped Griffin for too long. It's as if he captured the light and shadow not just of the body, but of the soul, she responded, completing the dialogue that had initiated their story. They contemplated each other in silence, the world around them momentarily disappearing. There was so much to say, so many wounds to heal, so many bridges to rebuild, that words seemed insufficient. Your grandmother told me you were leaving, Griffin finally began. There's nothing keeping me here. Her voice was soft but firm. I could keep you. The words came out before he could filter them. A sad smile crossed Laurel's face. I don't want to be kept, Griffin. I want to be chosen. Freely, consciously. Despite everything and because of everything we are. A security guard cleared his throat, reminding them they were in a public museum. Without a word, Griffin offered her his hand. She hesitated a moment before taking it, and together they went out to the museum gardens where the rain had given way to a timid sun filtering through scattered clouds. I read your letter, he said, as they sat on a secluded bench. Every word. And you came, she observed. Why? The question floated between them, laden with possibilities. Griffin could have responded with eloquence, with calculated phrases to move her. Instead, he opted for the naked truth. Because the idea of losing you terrifies me more than the idea of forgiving how we met. Laurel's eyes filled with contained tears. It wasn't just for my father, Griffin. You need to know that. Perhaps at the beginning, yes. But from the moment I truly got to know you, when I saw the man behind the empire, everything changed. I fell in love with you so completely that sometimes it frightened me. I fell in love with you too, he confessed, the words freeing themselves like long-caged birds. And that terrified me more than any business crisis. A tear finally escaped, rolling down Laurel's cheek. With a tenderness that surprised them both, Griffin dried it with his thumb. "I can't promise it will be easy," he continued. "I have ingrained habits, walls built over years. But I want to try, Laurel. I want to learn to love without fear, to trust without calculating risks, and I want to do it with you." "I have fears too," she admitted. "Fear of not being enough for your world, that one day you'll wake up and realize you need someone more sophisticated, more in line with the life you've built." "My world," Griffin smiled, taking her hands in his, "is a house of cards that sustains itself through inertia. Yours, in contrast, has real foundations: family, authenticity, true passion. If anyone should feel inadequate, it's me." The tension that had weighed between them began to dissolve slowly, like fog under the midday sun. It wasn't an instant happy ending, they both knew. It was the beginning of a path that would require work, patience, and above all, the will to choose each other every day, with full awareness of both their virtues and their defects. "What will happen with your company?" Laurel asked. "With Vivian, the shareholders, the crisis." "I made some decisions this morning," Griffin responded. "Changes I perhaps should have made a long time ago." He didn't tell her he had instructed Fletcher to initiate the process of transforming the Blackwood Group into a foundation with social purposes, maintaining profitability, but completely reorienting its purpose. He didn't tell her about the letter sent to Vivienne, offering her the option to lead the transition or step aside with a generous compensation. Those conversations would come later, when the fragile reconnection between them had strengthened. "There's something else," he added, remembering a crucial detail. "I received an email this morning from London." Laurel's face visibly tensed. "My father. He wants to speak with me," Griffin completed. "He wants to apologize personally for what happened 7 years ago. I wonder if you would be willing to accompany me to London." The proposal hung suspended between them, a bridge extended over an abyss that once seemed insurmountable. When Laurel finally smiled, Griffin felt that something long frozen inside him was, at last, beginning to thaw. "With you," she responded, intertwining her fingers with his. "I would go even further than London." The New York sun emerged completely from behind the clouds, bathing Central Park with a golden light that seemed to bless this imperfect but profoundly human reconciliation. The weight of the decisions made and yet to be made remained there, but for the first time in years, Griffin Blackwood felt he could breathe freely, as if the armor he had worn for so long was finally beginning to loosen. London welcomed them with an autumn in full bloom. Plane trees along the wide avenues were tinged with russet and gold, contrasting with the Victorian architecture that reminded visitors this city had once been the capital of the world. In the Claridge's Hotel, a suite with views of Hyde Park housed a couple whose tension was palpable. Griffin, impeccable in his tailored grey suit, adjusted his tie for the 3rd time in front of the mirror. Laurel, in a sober navy blue dress, observed the city from the balcony, her thoughts as distant as the invisible horizon beyond the Thames. "We can cancel," she said suddenly, turning toward him. "We don't have to do this today, or ever, if you're not ready." Griffin left his tie and approached her, taking her hands in his. In the 3 weeks since their reconciliation in New York, they had re-established a cautious but genuine connection. Each conversation, each gesture of affection, was like a brick carefully placed in the reconstruction of something that had once collapsed. "It's been 7 years, Laurel," he responded, with a calmness that surprised even himself. "I think I've postponed this meeting long enough." The taxi left them in front of a Georgian building in Belgravia. Dr. Malcolm Harrington, as Laurel had explained, had rebuilt his life in England working as a medical advisor for an international NGO, since he couldn't practice clinical medicine without revalidating his license, something he never attempted. The apartment was modest but elegant, with bookshelves full of books and framed photographs that silently narrated a life in exile. In several of them appeared Laurel at different stages of her growth, always with the same luminous smile that Griffin now knew so well. When Malcolm Harrington appeared in the living room, Griffin felt an unexpected commotion. He had imagined an imposing, perhaps intimidating man. Instead, who presented himself before him was an individual of medium height, with silver hair and the same intense eyes as Laurel, but marked by deep lines that spoke of regret and sleepless nights. "Mr. Blackwood," he greeted, extending a slightly trembling hand. "Thank you for coming." The handshake was brief but firm. Laurel observed the scene, holding her breath, like someone contemplating two volatile elements that could react violently upon contact. "I've prepared tea," continued Malcolm, heading toward a table set by the window. "Or if you prefer something stronger—" "Tea will be fine," responded Griffin, sitting with the rigid formality of someone attending a tense negotiation. During the first few minutes, the conversation remained on neutral ground. The London weather, the beauty of the city, the changes in New York since Malcolm had left. Laurel participated occasionally, like a translator between two mutually incomprehensible languages. Finally, when the teacups were half empty and the sun began to descend over the London horizon, Malcolm Harrington set down his cup with deliberate slowness and directly faced Griffin's gaze. "I suppose you wonder why I did it," he said without preamble. "Why I intervened in your life the way I did. The question has crossed my mind on occasion, yes," responded Griffin with contained sarcasm. Malcolm nodded, accepting the blow. "Audrey Mitchell arrived at my office 3 weeks before your wedding," he began, his voice acquiring the professional tone of the doctor he once was. "She suffered panic attacks, severe insomnia, symptoms that clearly indicated extreme stress. During our sessions, a pattern emerged. It wasn't the marriage itself she feared, but the sensation of betraying her own desires to fulfill others' expectations." Griffin listened motionless, each word unearthing memories he believed buried forever. "I should have limited myself to treating her symptoms, to helping her clarify her feelings," continued Malcolm. "Instead, I projected onto her my own fears, my own marital failure. I saw in her situation a reflection of my ex-wife, Laurel's mother, who confessed to me years after our divorce that she had married me to please her family, not out of true love." He paused, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. "I told Audrey that if she had such profound doubts, the pain of a breakup before marriage was better than the prolonged suffering of an inauthentic union. I used my authority as a doctor to validate a decision that, in reality, should have been exclusively hers." Laurel observed her father with a mixture of compassion and sadness. He had never before told her this story with such detail, with such rawness. "And what happened afterward?" asked Griffin, his voice strangely controlled. 2 years later, Audrey returned to my office," continued Malcolm. "She was depressed, deeply regretful. She told me she had made the biggest mistake of her life in abandoning you, that her doubts had been just normal fear before such an important step. By then, you had already transformed your life, had become the relentless businessman that the newspapers portrayed, and I understood the scope of my error. The silence that followed was dense, laden with contained emotions." "Why involve Laurel?" Griffin finally asked. "Why not approach me directly?" Malcolm briefly looked at his daughter before responding. "Cowardice, I suppose," he admitted with bitterness. "I feared your rejection, your justified anger. And also," he hesitated, "I also believed that my daughter, with her innate capacity to see the best in people, might discover if anything remained of the man Audrey had loved, something beyond the armor you had constructed." "You used me," Laurel intervened, her words more an observation than an accusation. "I tried to amend my mistake through you," Malcolm corrected. "It was selfish and manipulative. I know that now. I didn't calculate that you might really fall in love, that both of you might—" His voice broke slightly. "That something beautiful might be born from my terrible error." Griffin rose abruptly and walked to the window. The lights of London were beginning to turn on, an urban constellation that twinkled under the reddened sky of evening. For years he had imagined this moment, this confrontation with the indirect architect of his pain. He had mentally rehearsed accusations, reproaches, even some elaborate form of revenge. And yet now that the moment had arrived, what he felt was not the burning anger he expected, but a profound weariness. The weight of sustaining that resentment for so long now seemed greater than the relief any retribution could provide. "Audrey," he finally said, still with his back to them. "What became of her?" "She married 4 years ago," responded Malcolm, "to an architect from Boston. They have a son, but from what I know, she isn't happy. She writes to me occasionally, always indirectly asking about you." Griffin nodded in silence. It was strange, but the news no longer provoked any particular commotion. Audrey belonged to another time, another life. "What do you hope to obtain from this meeting, Dr. Harrington?" he asked, finally turning. "Absolution? Forgiveness?" The doctor held his gaze with dignity. I expect nothing that you're not willing to give, Mr. Blackwood. I only wanted to offer you the complete truth and perhaps, he looked at Laurel, perhaps the opportunity for my daughter to be happy without the shadow of my past mistakes. Laurel rose then, placing herself beside Griffin. Her presence, warm and firm at his side, was like an anchor amid the emotional tempest. I love your daughter, Griffin said simply, addressing Malcolm but taking Laurel's hand. Probably since the moment I saw her contemplating that hopper, long before I knew who she was or who you were. That's the only thing that matters now. The tears that Malcolm had stoically contained began to flow then. Thank you, he murmured, the word barely audible. I'm not doing it for you, Griffin clarified. I'm doing it for myself and for her. When they finally said goodbye, the night sky covered London like a starry mantle. In the taxi back to the hotel, Laurel rested her head on Griffin's shoulder, the silence between them comfortable for the first time in weeks. Are you all right? She finally asked. Griffin contemplated the London streets sliding past the window, reflecting on the question. Was he all right? How to define that state after a meeting he had both feared and yearned for in equal parts for years? I think so, he responded with genuine surprise. It's as if I've put down a very heavy suitcase I had been carrying without realizing. Laurel intertwined her fingers with his. Forgiveness is like that, she said softly. It's not always a gift for the other. Sometimes it's a gift for oneself. That night, in the intimacy of their suite overlooking Hyde Park, Griffin Blackwood slept without nightmares for the first time in 7 years. Beside him, Laurel kept vigil over his sleep, aware that they had just crossed together a threshold that neither could have traversed alone. What they didn't know was that, thousands of miles away, in New York, another storm was brewing. One that would test not only their newly healed relationship, but also everything Griffin had built, and everything he was beginning to believe in. The return to New York coincided with a premature fall that tinged Central Park with ochres and golds. At the airport, Fletcher waited for them with a tense expression that contrasted with the couple's renewed optimism. We have problems, he announced without preamble as he led them to the car. Vivienne has called another extraordinary shareholders' meeting. This time she has the support of the majority of shareholders. Griffin nodded, surprisingly serene. It was to be expected. You don't understand, Fletcher insisted. They don't just want to remove you from the chairmanship. They're questioning your mental capacity, suggesting you need a psychological evaluation. They've leaked private emails, conversations out of context. It's a full-on coup. New York traffic flowed around them as Laurel observed Griffin, looking for signs of the storm that would surely unleash inside him. To her surprise, she found him unusually calm. Do you have the documents I asked you to prepare before my trip? He asked his attorney. Ready and reviewed, confirmed Fletcher. But Griffin, are you sure about this? Once we make it public, there's no turning back. I've never been more certain of anything. In the Park Avenue penthouse, now strangely alien as if it belonged to another life, Griffin meticulously prepared his strategy, while Laurel observed fascinated by this new facet of him. The cold determination of the businessman combined with an inner serenity he didn't possess before. May I ask what you're planning exactly? She finally said. Griffin looked up from his computer, an enigmatic smile on his lips. A reconstruction, he responded simply, of everything. The extraordinary meeting was convened in the main hall of the Plaza Hotel, a space of classic opulence that had witnessed countless negotiations and agreements among the American economic elite. Vivienne Montgomery presided over the table, her impeccable red suit like a declaration of war. Around her, familiar faces of shareholders and directors, some uncomfortable, others openly hostile. When Griffin entered, with Laurel and Fletcher flanking him, a murmur ran through the room. He wasn't wearing his usual formal suit, but linen pants and a white shirt without a tie. The contrast with the surrounding formality was as deliberate as it was effective. Mr. Blackwood, Vivienne began, her tone falsely cordial, we appreciate your presence in these delicate circumstances. Spare me the theatre, Vivienne, Griffin responded with a disarming smile. We all know why we're here. Without waiting for a response, he advanced to the center of the room and placed a sealed envelope before each member of the board. Before you begin voting on my mental capacity or my permanence in the chairmanship, I suggest you read this. The silence was absolute as the envelopes were opened simultaneously. As they advanced in the reading, their faces transformed. Surprise, confusion, even horror in some cases. "What does this mean?" Vivian demanded to know, her voice losing its usual control. "It means," Griffin responded calmly, "that 3 weeks ago I transferred 60% of my shares to an irrevocable charitable foundation. The Blakely Foundation, to be exact." Chaos erupted in the room. Voices rising in protest, questions launched simultaneously, Vivian trying to re-establish order. "This is madness," exclaimed one of the principal shareholders. "You can't do this without consulting us." "In fact, I can," corrected Griffin. "They were my personal shares, and now they belong to a foundation whose purpose is to guarantee that this business group functions with ethics, sustainability, and social responsibility. This will devalue the company," warned Vivienne, her pale face contrasting with the red of her suit. "Investors will flee." "Some, perhaps," Griffin conceded, "but others, more visionary, will recognize that the future of business isn't in limitless exploitation, but in the balance between profit and purpose." He turned toward Laurel, who remained silent by the door, her eyes bright with pride. "By the way," he continued, addressing the board again, "I present to you the new director of the Blakely Foundation, Laurel Harrington, art restorer, and, soon, my wife." The announcement fell like a bomb. Laurel herself seemed the most surprised of all, her hands covering her mouth in a gesture of astonishment. "You can't do this," repeated Vivian, her voice now a desperate whisper. "You'll destroy everything we've built." "No, Vivian," Griffin corrected gently. "I'm rebuilding it, on more solid foundations." The following days were a media whirlwind. "The billionaire who donated his empire," headlined the newspapers. "Ethical revolution in the business world," analyzed the economists. The stock initially fluctuated but stabilized when international investors with sensitivity toward sustainability began to show interest in the renewed Blackwood Group. Amid this public storm, Griffin and Laurel found refuge in an unexpected place, Eleanor Harrington's historic house in Blakely. Seated on that same back porch where months ago they had their first sincere conversation, they now planned a future that neither would have imagined possible. "I still can't believe you named a foundation after my town," commented Laurel, her head resting on Griffin's shoulder as they contemplated the Georgia stars. "It seemed appropriate," he responded. "This place taught me what's truly important. It reminded me who I was before I became a money-making machine." Eleanor appeared at the door, bringing a tray with steaming cups of hot chocolate with cinnamon. "The news doesn't stop talking about you two," she commented, sitting beside them. "My granddaughter and the crazy billionaire who gave away his fortune. All of America thinks you've lost your mind, Griffin." "Perhaps I've found it," he corrected, gratefully accepting the hot cup. "Or rather, I've found my heart." The elderly woman smiled, her eyes shining with approval. "What you've done," Laurel began, hesitating. "Doesn't it frighten you? You've given up the control you valued so much." "I've given up the illusion of control," Griffin clarified. "And in exchange I've gained something much more valuable, freedom. The freedom to choose who I truly want to be." As night fell over the ancient historic town, 3 generations united by chance and shared decisions shared much more than hot chocolate. They shared the certainty that sometimes the most painful losses can lead to the most precious findings, and that true wealth could never be measured in figures, but in the capacity to break promises that chain us in order to make others that liberate us. What none of them suspected, as the crickets sang and the moon illuminated the colonial rooftops, was that the final chapter of this story was yet to be written, a chapter that would test one last time the solidity of this reconstruction, both personal and professional. Winter arrived in New York with unusual ferocity. The snow, a faithful visitor to the Big Apple, covered Fifth Avenue with a white mantle that slowed the frantic rhythm of the city. In the new headquarters of the Blackwood Group, a restored building in Greenwich Village that contrasted with the corporate skyscrapers of the previous location, Griffin contemplated the wintry landscape from his office. 4 months had passed since the radical transformation of his business empire into a hybrid entity between company and foundation. The process hadn't been without difficulties. Shareholders who abandoned ship, employees resistant to change, media outlets that alternated between portraying Griffin as a visionary or a lunatic. However, Gradually, a new corporate culture began to establish itself. Laurel had assumed the direction of the Blakely Foundation with a determination that surprised everyone except Griffin. Her experience in art restoration proved surprisingly transferable to the restoration of a company. Patience, long-term vision, respect for original integrity, and capacity to distinguish the essential from the superficial. "You have a visitor," announced Fletcher's voice from the door. "Says it's important." Griffin turned, intrigued by the tense expression of his friend and attorney. "Who?" "Audrey Mitchell." The name fell like an ice cube in the warm room. A name that belonged to another life, another Griffin. "Send her in," he said after a moment, his voice controlled. The woman who entered minutes later barely resembled the Audrey he remembered. The face that had once shone with youthful vitality now showed the marks of time and perhaps regret. She was dressed with a sober elegance that contrasted with the bohemian style she had preferred in her youth. "Griffin," she greeted, her voice slightly trembling. "Thank you for receiving me." "To what do I owe this visit, Audrey?" he asked directly, gesturing for her to take a seat. She remained standing, as if not feeling worthy of the comfort offered. "I've followed your story in the media," she began. "What you've done with your company, with your life. It's extraordinary." "Thank you," he responded dryly, "though I doubt you've come all this way just to congratulate me." A sad smile crossed Audrey's face. "Always so direct," she murmured. "Some things don't change." She approached the window, contemplating the snow falling silently. "My marriage has ended," she finally said. "Or rather, it never really began. I spent 7 years with a man I respected but didn't love, trying to convince myself I had made the right decision." Griffin waited, intuiting there was more. "When I read about your transformation, about how you had renounced control in favor of something more meaningful," she continued, "something broke inside me. I realized I've lived prisoner to a decision made out of fear, not conviction." She turned to face him, her eyes bright with contained tears. "I've come to ask your forgiveness, Griffin. And perhaps to ask if there's any possibility, however small, that we might—" She left the sentence unfinished, but her intention was clear. There was a time when this scene would have been Griffin's recurring dream. Audrey returning, regretful, asking for a second chance. A time when he would have savored this moment as a sweet revenge or a long-awaited validation. But that Griffin no longer existed. "I forgive you, Audrey," he said with a sincerity that surprised them both. "I do it for me, not for you, because carrying that resentment was like having a stone tied to my neck, slowly drowning me." She nodded, a tear finally escaping. "And the other part?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Is there any possibility—" The door opened at that moment and Laurel entered with a folder in her hands. "Griffin, the documents for the new restoration school in—" She stopped abruptly upon perceiving the tension in the room. The three remained suspended in a triangle of crossed gazes. Laurel confused, Audrey suddenly pale, Griffin surprisingly calm. "Laurel," he said, extending his hand toward her, "I'd like you to meet Audrey Mitchell. Audrey, this is Laurel Harrington, my fiancée." The moment crystallized in a silence as dense as the snow falling outside. Laurel, immediately understanding who this woman was, showed admirable composure. "Pleased to meet you," she said, with a dignity that moved Griffin. "I've heard about you." Audrey seemed to shrink before Laurel's radiant presence, so evidently happy and secure beside Griffin. "Likewise," she murmured. "I didn't know. The news didn't mention—" "We keep some things private," explained Griffin, approaching Laurel and gently taking the folder from her hands. "Especially the most valuable ones." The understanding of what she had just witnessed reflected on Audrey's face. Not only had Griffin moved on, but he had found a deeper, more authentic love than the one they had shared. A love based not on expectations or conveniences, but on the true knowledge of the other. "I should go," she said, collecting her purse with trembling hands. "I'm sorry for the interruption." "There's nothing to be sorry for," responded Laurel with a generosity that was born of security. "Sometimes we need to close doors to be able to move forward." When Audrey left, a contemplative silence settled in the office. Laurel approached Griffin, studying his face for signs of emotional turbulence. "Are you all right?" she finally asked. Griffin looked at her, really looked at her, marveling once more at the quiet strength of this woman who had brought down his walls, not with brute force, but with persistent authenticity. "I'm better than all right," he responded with sincerity. "For the first time in my life, I feel I'm exactly where I should be, with exactly the person I should be with." That night, as New York slept under its white mantle, Griffin and Laurel walked through a deserted, snow-covered Central Park, their footprints marking a shared path on the immaculate surface. The transformation wasn't only visible in the exterior world of companies and foundations, but in something deeper and more fundamental: Griffin's newly discovered capacity to be truly present, to feel fully without filters or armor. "Do you know what day it is today?" asked Laurel, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. Griffin smiled. "Exactly 1 year since we met at that gala at the Waldorf." "A year," she repeated, amazed. "Sometimes it seems like a lifetime, and other times it seems like yesterday." They stopped beside the frozen lake, the Belvedere Castle gleaming ethereally under the moonlight. Without a word, Griffin knelt on the snow, taking a small velvet box from his coat pocket. "I've already asked you to marry me," he said, opening the box to reveal a simple but beautiful ring with a small emerald that captured the winter light. "But I want to do it right this time. In the right place for the right reasons." Laurel held her breath, her eyes shining with emotion. "Laurel Harrington," he continued, his voice firm despite the cold, "you taught me that promises made from fear are chains, not shields. Today I want to make a new promise from love and freedom. I promise to choose you every day consciously, not because I need you to complete something I'm missing, but because together we create something beautiful that neither could create alone." Tears ran freely down Laurel's cheeks, freezing slightly along the way. "Would you do me the honor of sharing this imperfect life, this continuous reconstruction, as my wife?" "Yes," she responded, her voice breaking with emotion. 1,000 times yes." When the ring found its place on Laurel's finger, both knew it wasn't just a symbol of union, but of liberation. The final test had been passed, not through rejection of the past, but through its full acceptance and integration into the greater story they now wrote together. The snow continued falling softly, erasing the footprints they had left behind, but it didn't matter. What counted was the path that stretched before them, a path they would no longer walk alone or protected behind walls of fear, but together, vulnerable, and for that very reason, invincible. Spring arrived in Blakely with an explosion of life. Dogwoods in bloom dotted the slopes with white, and the Kinchafuni Creek, fed by summer rains, ran vigorously between stones polished by centuries of persistence. In the small Methodist church, built in the 19th century and lovingly restored over generations, the preparations for the wedding advanced with the chaotic efficiency typical of towns where everyone knows everyone, and each event is the business of the entire community. "I can't believe I agreed to get married here," commented Griffin, observing how the town women decorated the austere interior of the church with wildflowers and olive branches. "The CEO of Goldman Sachs just confirmed his attendance. Where is he going to stay? In the bed and breakfast where the bathroom is shared?" Fletcher, at his side, laughed with amusement. "You could have taken them all to a luxury resort in the Hamptons," he reminded him. "It was your decision to celebrate it here." "Our decision," Griffin corrected, "and I don't regret it. It just amuses me to imagine America's business elite trying to find signal for their phones in these historic alleys." In Eleanor Harrington's Victorian house, the activity was equally frantic. Laurel, surrounded by her grandmother and childhood friends, tried on the final adjustments to her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of natural silk that perfectly complemented her unaffected beauty. "Your father arrived this morning," announced Eleanor, adjusting a seam. "He's staying at the tailor's house." Laurel nodded, a mixture of emotions crossing her face. The relationship with her father remained complex, but the past year had brought a cautious reconstruction, parallel to Griffin's transformation and that of his company. "Do you think everything will be all right, Grandma?" she asked, a rare moment of vulnerability showing through her usual strength. The elderly woman set down her needle and approached her granddaughter, taking her face between hands calloused by decades of hard work. "Marriage isn't a destination, sweetheart," she said with the wisdom of years. "It's a journey that begins each morning when you decide to continue building alongside the person you've chosen. And you two have already overcome tests that many 50-year marriages would never face." On the eve of the wedding, following local tradition, The bride and groom were to spend the night apart. Griffin found himself in the small room that had been prepared for him in the mayor's house, when a soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he said, expecting to find Fletcher with some last-minute detail. Instead, it was Dr. Malcolm Harrington who entered, carrying 2 glasses and a bottle of Georgia peach brandy. "I hope I'm not disturbing," he said with a certain timidity. "I thought perhaps we could have that conversation we never really had." Griffin nodded, indicating he should take the only available chair while he sat on the edge of the bed. Time and events had softened his initial animosity, replacing it with a kind of resigned acceptance. "I won't lie to you," Malcolm began while serving the liquor. "When Laurel told me you were in love, I felt afraid. I feared you might seek revenge through her." "The idea crossed my mind," Griffin admitted honestly, "for a fleeting moment." "I would have deserved it," the doctor nodded. "But she wouldn't have." They drank in silence, the fruity sweetness of the brandy contrasting with the bitterness of shared memories. "I want you to know," Malcolm finally continued, "that I'm deeply proud of the man my daughter has chosen. Not the successful businessman or the philanthropist, but the man who had the courage to rebuild himself, to break the cycle of pain I helped create." Griffin studied the face of the man who had indirectly altered the course of his life, finding in him not the villain he had imagined for years, but an imperfect human being who carried his own scars. "For you know something curious, Doctor," he said, his voice softer than usual. "If Audrey hadn't left me that day, if you hadn't intervened, I probably would have become another kind of man, perhaps happier at the beginning, but also more complacent, less tested by life." "And would that man have been worthy of my daughter?" Malcolm asked, a sad smile on his lips. "Probably not," Griffin acknowledged. "And certainly he wouldn't have been prepared to love her as I do now, with eyes completely open." They raised their glasses in a silent toast, sealing not a friendship, perhaps, but a necessary peace for the new chapter that would begin the next day. The wedding morning dawned with that intense blue that only the Georgia sky seems capable of producing. The small church, which normally accommodated no more than 50 people, had been adapted to receive the 200 guests, a strange mixture of local residents, business magnates, artists, and the extended family of both bride and groom. When Griffin, standing beside the century-old altar, saw Laurel advance on her father's arm, time seemed to stop. It wasn't just her natural beauty enhanced by the elegant simplicity of her dress, but the luminous certainty in her eyes, the same glow of authenticity that had captivated him from the first moment at that distant gala. The vows, written by themselves, spoke not of promises of perfection, but of commitment to shared growth, not of possession, but of freedom within the union, not of a happy ending, but of a conscious beginning. "I promise to give you roots so you feel secure," said Griffin, his voice firm despite the emotion, "and wings so you can fly as high as you desire. I promise to remind you who you are when the world tries to convince you to be someone else," responded Laurel, tears of joy shining in her eyes, "and to help you discover who you can become." When the ancient ritual reached its conclusion, and they were declared husband and wife, the applause that erupted in the church seemed to celebrate not just the union of two people, but the triumph of authentic love over fear, of vulnerability over armor, of truth over appearances. The celebration that followed was as eclectic as the guest list. Southern barbecue served on fine china, local wine alongside French champagne, bluegrass music alternating with contemporary tunes. Two worlds not just coexisting, but mutually enriching, like the bride and groom themselves. At one point during the celebration, while Griffin conversed with a group of international investors, interested in the new business model of his group, he noticed Laurel dancing with her father, a moment of reconciliation that seemed to close a circle. He observed her laugh twirl, fully lived the moment, and felt a gratitude so profound it almost physically hurt. Later, when the celebration continued under the Georgia stars, Griffin and Laurel briefly escaped, climbing to the gazebo of the old mansion that crowned the town. From there, they contemplated the Kinchafuni Valley, bathed in the silvery light of the moon, the lights of the celebration twinkling like fireflies in the main square. "Regrets about choosing Blakely instead of the Hamptons?" she asked, leaning against his chest. "Not for a second," he responded, enveloping her in his arms. "This place is part of our story. It's where our true connection began." "You know what my grandmother told me this morning?" commented Laurel, turning to look him in the eyes. "That some people spend their entire lives searching for treasures in distant lands without realizing that the true wealth was always in their own backyard, waiting to be discovered." Griffin smiled, recognizing Eleanor's wisdom in those words. "Your grandmother should write a book," he said, "or at least advise my board of directors." Laurel's laughter, clear and genuine, rose in the night like a promise of luminous days to come. Not perfect days, because perfection had never been their goal, but authentic days shared, lived with full awareness. As they returned to the celebration, holding hands like two teenagers, both knew this wasn't the end of their story, but merely the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter written not from fear or necessity, but from the free and conscious choice of two people who had learned through pain and joy that true love doesn't consist of finding someone who completes you, but in finding someone alongside whom you want to grow. 5 years later, the Park Avenue penthouse had long been sold. In its place, a restored Victorian house on the outskirts of Blakely, with a garden where ancient pecan trees alternated with children's play equipment, served as home for the Blackwood Harrington family. Griffin, now 42, contemplated the sunset from the porch while observing Laurel play with their 4-year-old daughter Eleanor, named in honor of her great-grandmother. The little girl had her father's steel blue eyes and her mother's contagious laughter, a combination that melted even the hardest heart. The Blackwood Group, now known simply as the Blakely Foundation, had transformed into an international reference for purpose-driven companies. The hybrid model that combined profitability with social impact had inspired changes in corporations around the world. Vivienne Montgomery, after initial resistance, had finally found her place in this new structure, directing the international division with the same relentless efficiency as always, but now with a purpose greater than simple profit. Laurel divided her time between the strategic direction of the foundation and her original passion, restoration. Under her leadership, they had created a school that recovered traditional artistic techniques while training young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, thus combining cultural preservation with social impact. Life hadn't been perfect, of course. They had faced challenges: resistance to business change, a complicated pregnancy, the painful loss of Eleanor 2 years ago. But each obstacle they had crossed together, not as two dependent halves, but as two complete beings who chose to share both joys and difficulties. "Daddy, look!" shouted Eleanor, running to him with a ladybug on the open palm of her small hand. "It has 7 spots. Grandma Eleanor said that brings good luck." Griffin crouched to admire the insect, marveling once more at his daughter's capacity to find magic in the everyday, a gift inherited from her mother and great-grandmother. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," he said, kissing her forehead. "Do you remember what we should do with beautiful things we find? Admire them, and then set them free," the girl recited seriously, before running back to the garden to release her discovery. Laurel approached, sitting beside him on the porch steps. "You've created a little philosopher," she commented, intertwining her fingers with his. "I had good raw material," he responded, gently kissing her hand. "And excellent teachers." The sun was beginning to hide behind the distant mountains, tinting the sky with oranges and purples. In moments like this, Griffin often reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had led him here. How a broken promise, that made in a Newport chapel, swearing never to love again, had actually been the first step toward a life infinitely richer than he could ever have imagined. "What are you thinking about?" asked Laurel, always attentive to the subtle changes in his expression. "About promises," he responded honestly. "About how sometimes breaking them is the greatest act of courage." She nodded, understanding immediately, as she always did. "Promises made from fear chain us," she said, evoking her grandmother's words. "Promises made from love liberate us." Eleanor returned running, her small bare feet leaving prints on the dirt path. "The ladybug flew to the biggest pecan tree," she announced triumphantly. "Do you think she'll be happy there, Daddy?" "I think she'll be happy because she's exactly where she should be," Griffin responded, embracing his daughter and extending an arm to include Laurel in that perfect circle. As the first stars began to appear in the spring sky, the three remained thus, united not by chains of obligation or fear, but by the daily and conscious choice to create together something that none could create alone. The financial empire Griffin had built paled in comparison to this immeasurable richness, the newly discovered capacity to be fully present, to feel deeply, to love without reservations. Of all the achievements of his life, none made him prouder than this. Having had the courage to break a promise made from pain, to be able to make a new one from love. Because some promises, he discovered, are made to be broken. And in that rupture, sometimes we find the freedom to write a different story. A story where scars are not just marks of past wounds, but maps that guide us toward a more authentic and full future. "I love you," he whispered to Laurel. Simple words he once feared to pronounce and now flowed as naturally as his breathing. "And I love you," she responded, her voice laden with the quiet certainty of someone who has found their home. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days I choose to wake up by your side." In the garden, the fireflies began their nocturnal dance, small earthly stars that illuminated the path home. Eleanor pointed to them with delight, her crystalline laughter rising in the night like a blessing. And thus, under the same sky that had witnessed so many promises made and broken throughout the centuries, the Blackwood-Harrington family silently celebrated the most valuable of human achievements, the capacity to transform pain into growth, fear into courage, and the chains of the past into wings to fly toward a future built not on perfection, but on authentic love and the conscious choice to be better together than apart.